So welcome back to the class. I'm gonna share my screen here. Here we go. You all can see the PowerPoint? Yes, okay, great. And if you wouldn't mind muting until you speak, I think it'll be easier. And I want you all to speak if please do speak throughout the class. Um, but we'll get started. So tonight's theme is power and sexuality. I'm going to start with some icebreakers like we've been doing. So the first question is, what do you think the power dynamics between different genders looked like in biblical times as compared to today? What are some thoughts on this? Go ahead.
Women were definitely second-class citizens.
Yeah, and how do you think today compares?
It's a little better.
A little better. Gotcha. Linda?
I think women were non-entities then. They hardly got any recognition in the writings. And today, while the glass ceiling is being broken by some, there are still many occupations where the salary structure for women is different than men. And it's not always so easy.
Gotcha. Well, I suppose you could say even getting a salary at all is probably not something that biblical women typically, unless they had a certain profession, could expect. So, yeah, Sheila.
It seems to me that women that are in the Bible are very strong.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk a little bit more about
you
that.
have Yael, you have the daughters, you
You
have Miriam is pretty strong, Sarah is strong.
Sure.
Hannah, I mean, when they list a woman,
But
she's
yeah, and we talked
powerful.
also a little bit about that in the first class too, when we talked about the named and the unnamed, right?
Right.
The value of which women were named in the Tanakh certainly had to do a little bit more, tended to do with their strength of character or
Well,
will.
but the wife of Manoach was, I mean, it was with Samson's mother. She doesn't have a name, and she's pretty
Right,
powerful.
and there were examples where you would think that some of these women would have names, and sometimes they are given names elsewhere, like, in Midrash, or, Talmudic discussions, but sometimes not. So we talked a little bit about that. Yeah, anyone else? Helena?
Even nowadays, in a lot of places, the women have to be 10 times better than men in order to be considered equal. You know what I mean? It's frozen. I lost you.
Yeah, she froze.
Yeah. I thought for it.
To the degree that men have. Yeah. Sorry, I think my
Yeah.
connection wasn't stable for a second there. Do you have anything else to add about that, Helena?
So what I'm saying, it's always women in certain professions had to be 10 times better than men in order to be considered even equal.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about pay and stuff like this. I'm just talking about other things.
Yes, that's very true. And we see that all the time play out in many, many different fields. Yes. Yeah. Anyone else have anything to add to the first icebreaker question? All right, so then we're going to move on to the next one. Think of some examples of powerful women you know of. And this doesn't have to just be in Tanakh. This, please think elsewhere too. Powerful women. What makes them powerful? Yes, Linda?
So I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
I was thinking of Ruth Bader Ginsburg too. What makes her powerful?
Because for a woman who was vertically challenged, she was 9 feet tall as far as her brains, her willingness to say what she believed in, and she believed in justice. and she wouldn't accept, she wouldn't stand for stupidity and other inanities.
Hmm. Yeah, and she really lived her life by her terms too. She really took charge. I don't know if anyone's watched the biopic, but certainly not even just as before she was even a Supreme Court justice, by the way, the way she put herself through law school and supported her family and her husband while he was ill. Um, Incredible strength of will and character. And this was even well before.
And she gave up Harvard for Columbia.
Hmm. Yeah,
And she had also to struggle with injustice against her.
of course, yes. Other examples of powerful women that we want to think about?
Golda
What makes them
Meir.
powerful? What was that?
Golda Meir.
Golda Meir. So what makes her powerful?
She was a pioneer in what she was doing.
Hmm. Very good example. Yes.
What's
Sheila.
interesting is that Golda Meir's sister was also very powerful. She was the head of the JCC in Bridgeport, Connecticut when we were there.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
this was in the 60s. So it
Gotcha.
runs in that family.
Sure. Any other examples that come to mind of powerful women?
But I
Pelosi.
think also how they are raised. If they
How
were
they're
taught,
raised.
yeah, if they are taught they can achieve anything in spite of them being women,
Building them
it's
up instead of
also,
getting in their way, right?
yeah.
Well, Pelosi is that way.
Sure.
Don't tangle with her. And I think some
Yeah.
of the women in Congress are becoming a little more powerful even than the men.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm. It does kind of go back a little bit again to what Helena was saying about women being like 10 times as qualified, but when they really stand for what they believe in and what's gonna, do right by the rest of the world. So certainly some of those women who have gotten into those positions of power are very powerful and wonderful examples of inspiration, I think, to all of us and not just to women, but to everybody. Any other examples that anyone wants to share? All right, then we're going to move on. Um, so I want to first talk about Dina. Um, she's actually sort of not an example of power, but sort of an example of the lack thereof. Um, so, I mean, we'll review the story. I'm sure many of us are familiar. First of all, I want to say that she's sort of listed as Jacob's only daughter, or was she? I do want to point out that last week we were reading, and it mentioned like the blessings of Jacob's children, right? And it said of his sons and of his daughters. It said daughters in like the plural form. And sure, that could be referring to daughters-in-law, but I do sometimes wonder whether Jacob had other daughters. If you consider the fact that he had, um, four wives, I mean, two wives, two concubines to share the responsibility of birthing children, it would stand to reason that there could have been more daughters that just weren't named. Yeah, did you have I see a hand raise?
Yeah,
Question?
are you, the illusion would also be, or the analogy would also be the Adam and Eve example, that in theory there had to have been daughters.
Oh, sure, of course. Well, yeah, otherwise if there hadn't been, then how could the world have been populated in the first place, right? Um, exactly, yeah. So, and that also again, that kind of goes back to what we talked about, the named versus the unnamed. And that kind of comes into play here. So Dina seems to exist more as an object in her own story. There's really no sense of agency that she has. So she's named, um, I think primarily because of this, what happens in the story, the rape of Dina and subsequent slaughter of Shechem, her husband. So the story goes that Shechem, saw her and I mean, it's unclear in the language. It depends on how you translate that either he raped her. So either it was against her will or they just had sex and they weren't married yet, right? So that's like a defilement, especially in those days because a young woman's virginity, I think, was something that was valuable, made her valuable in society for the prospect of marriage. And so I think certainly because it was unsanctioned in advance by her family, that they could have even had that as been as reason enough for it to be considered a rape, even if she was willing. So unclear if it was actual rape, but it is listed often as a rape for Dinah. And then, of course, the story went that Shechem actually was in love with her, wanted to marry her, wanted to do right by her, you know, and buy her bride price from the family, and make it right with the family, and of course that didn't go over very well in terms of the negotiations. Her brothers Simeon and Levi um, made the demand that Shechem, who was sort of like a prince, basically considered a prince in among his people in his land, and they demanded that he that he circumcise himself, and not just him, but the rest of his male kinsfolk, like his tribe, and he agrees. So honestly, the fact that he does that makes me think that because that's a very extreme thing to do, not just for himself but for his people, and the fact that they agree, they want to join their peoples. It seems like there's a certain amount of care there. And so it does make that always made me question his motives towards Dina. Do you have a question or a comment, Sheila?
Yeah, it, well, I think the implication is that Shem did all this so he could conquer Israel.
That could be one
But
interpretation.
yeah, I mean, why did they act this way? I mean, it would have been very natural. Good, go, let's join them. We'll have some more people on our side. But they weren't interested in so-called conversion, really. They were not interested in having them at all.
I don't know, but if you consider, undergoing circumcision as an adult
Yeah,
male, especially in those times without any anesthesia or anything like that, and especially with they didn't have like medicines like we have today. I think it is a pretty extreme thing to do.
yeah.
So, I mean, but you bring up a valid point. I'm gonna actually switch for a moment. I'm gonna switch to an article. Oh, Judy, I see your hand is raised.
I was gonna comment on Dina some more. Are you going back to her, or are you gonna
Yeah, we're still talking about Dina.
Oh, you still are, because I was gonna continue her story.
Yeah, well, okay, so yes, continuing in the rest of her story, obviously, what happens with Shechem and his male kinsfolk, they all undergo circumcision, and Simeon and Levi stealthily sort of wait 3 days until all the men are incapacitated by their pain after the circumcision, and they come in and they slaughter all of the men, and they come in and they pillage, and they take plunder. I'm not sure if they take any of the women. I'm not sure, but it's definitely given as sort of a reason that Simeon and Levi aren't given the portion of the inheritance. If you look at the elder among Jacob's sons, the eldest is Reuben, right? Reuven, and he um purportedly slept with Bilhah, which was not his mother, but was one of Jacob's concubines. So that was a sort of a no-no. So Jacob, didn't give him as big of a portion because of that. Simeon and Levi, they did this, and they sort of made Jacob hated, and left him in sort of fear that there could be some sort of retaliation eventually down the line. Even though he had nothing to do with it, it was just Simeon and Levi, but he definitely did not approve of their actions there. So yeah, did you want to add?
I was gonna actually talk about Dina's story afterwards. Is it okay? So
What would you like to add?
So one of the stories could be is that she goes back to Yaakov and has a daughter, and Yaakov doesn't want to keep her there because she'll be a single mom, and a scandal, scandal for the family, so to speak. He puts on some kind of a silver tray or something on her, around her chest, sends her away. She winds up in Potiphar's home, Potiphar's area, who adopts her because they are childless. And when she grows up, she becomes Joseph's wife.
Well, I don't know about those timelines. Where are you getting that story from?
Research. I had to talk about her, so yeah,
Gotcha. Because I don't think that the timeline necessarily fits because it's supposed to be given as many generations later when the Hebrews are slaves in Egypt. But it's a very interesting
well,
story.
that's
Certainly, I mean,
that's one of the reasons that the rabbis are okay with Yosef and his kids is because she's actually a lineage from Yaakov.
gotcha. Well, I have heard a midrash about Potiphar's wife uh, wanting Joseph because she knows that there's supposed to be a connection between them, but it's actually her daughter who marries Joseph. Um, yeah, I see a hand raised. Anything you want to add?
Well, two things. One is that, and then a question to add. I mean, Shimon and Levi, it's stronger than that. They're the only two sons that never become tribes
Exactly.
in the
Well,
full
yeah,
sense. I mean,
the full in terms
Shimon
of having land.
disappears.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Shimon gets land, but it's so far in the south
yeah,
that by by the end of the Torah or the next book, I think it's the next book, but certainly by Shoftim, Shimon's gone. It's been absorbed into Yehuda.
yeah.
And Levi, I mean, doesn't get land. So it, plus there's
Relies on the yeah.
all this plague evidence about the tribe of Shimon. That's actually one. But I would be interested for Judy. The last time I remember looking into Midrash on Dina using the Book of Legends, the English translation of Book of Legends, and there was no Midrash. And that uses everything from Midrash Rabbah to the Mechilta to whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what Judy just cited, at least from I've seen, does not appear in more traditional midrashic sources. I'd be very interested to know where those midrashim are from.
Yeah, well, I would have to say that at least in terms of what's in the Torah, she's not mentioned again. There's
Oh
no
no,
like
I wasn't
so
just. I
it
was on
almost seems to me,
midrash.
like I said, that she's like an object in her own story. She it's like the only reason she's named is because she like what happens to her is the reason why Shimon and Levi are not given portions. Like that seems like to me like the only reason she's given a name in the course of the story. Okay, I'm gonna share the screen here with an article on Dina. I don't know if we're gonna go through the whole thing. Okay, so it does say here, Dina is the only daughter of the patriarch Jacob, at least the only one named. Others are mentioned in Genesis 37, 35, and 46:15, perhaps including granddaughters. Her mother Leah bore her after 6 sons and named her Dina, meaning her judgment, although no explanation for her name is given in the biblical account in contrast to the naming of the sons. I want to point that out. The story of Dinah recounts an episode in which the girl or young woman goes out to see the daughters of the land, but is raped, seduced, and/or abducted by Shechem, a Hivite prince, who subsequently falls in love with her. Shechem asks his father Hamor to negotiate marriage terms. Jacob is silent on the matter, but Dinah's brothers are distressed by the outrage for such a thing as not done to a daughter of Jacob. They demand that Shechem and all the males of the town circumcise themselves before intermarrying with Jacob's family, a proposition made in guile. The residents of Shechem agree, presuming they will collectively gain both wealth and women by the deal. But on the third day, when all the male residents are in dire pain from the circumcision, Simeon and Levi, full brothers of Dinah, enter the town, slaughter all the men, and rescue Dinah from Shechem's house. The other brothers then pillage the town in revenge for the defilement of their sister. Jacob is displeased, for now he's become odious to the natives of the land, but the brothers are given the last word, should our sister be treated like a whore, right? With the exception of the opening verse, Dinah is wholly passive in the story. She is acted upon and given no voice. After she returns to her father's household, she is never heard of again in the biblical narrative, though she is mentioned along with the 66 descendants of Jacob who go down from Canaan to Egypt. So that's like the surface level shots of like what happens in the story. Not all scholars agree that she was raped, forced into sexual relations against her will, unlike in the account of the rape of Tamar by her half-brother Amnon. not Tamar, that the Tamar we're going to talk about, but Tamar, the daughter of from the kingdom of David, right? So we do not hear Dinah speak or cry out in resistance before Shechem takes her. Further, while Amnon violently overpowered Tamar despite her pleas of protest, it is not clear that Shechem forced himself upon Dinah. Rather, he took her, lay with her, and debased her. In the biblical world of the ancient Near East, when a virgin had sex out of wedlock, whether seduced or raped, she was devalued in terms of her social status, bringing shame upon the family. Her virginity was crucial in negotiations over bride price and the familial alliances forged through marriage. In legal discourse around sexual intercourse with a virgin outside of wedlock, whether she was betrothed to another man or not, the woman was presumed to have consented if she did not cry out in protest in the city or town, and to have been raped if she was taken in the open country where her cries could not have been heard. So that's just straight up. That's straight out of Deuteronomy in terms of the laws. The woman's will or testimony was simply not taken into account. Given that Dinah was taken in the open country, her father and brothers presumed she had been raped, as the parallel terms suggest. She was defiled, treated like a whore. It was deemed an outrage. Whether the seducer or rapist would normally be forced to pay the virgin bride price for the daughter and marry her, Dinah's brothers negotiate terms with Shechem and his father disingenuously, with no intention of sanctioning the marriage. The story then may be read as a polemic against intermarriage, which we'll talk about a little bit more too, with where the adoption of Dinah becomes the pretext for the severance of ties with Shechem and the Hivites, one of the Canaanite tribes. So this is I do want to point out, it talks about the expression speaking to the heart, ingratiating oneself after a breach, that he desired her, and that they would stand to gain a lot, I think, by linking their families together. And I think that they wanted that. So, I mean, Sheila, to your point, like it was definitely a desirable outcome that the family should be linked. I don't think that they necessarily wanted to take over. Just think they wanted to be part of the success of Jacob and his family, and that they thought they stood to gain a lot from linking themselves together. So that maybe that was a good reason why they considered it worthwhile to do that.
I don't quite understand also why Shimon and Levi get involved. It's Jacob's problem.
That's true.
In other words, Shimon and Levi, as you say,
That's a
she's
fair
an
point.
object. We're trying to explain why Shimon and Levi didn't get land. And so
Right.
we're making up a story that may or may not have taken place as it's described.
Right.
We're also trying
Right.
to get rid of a tribe,
Yeah.
an enemy country.
Yeah. So it's a I mean we can't really know. So we're only, we can only, read and do research based on and hunches based on what we see. So it presents the impossibility of integration with the Canaanites in the land. The destiny of the young woman's body are, so those are the negotiations. The final rhetorical question of the chapter is posed by the brothers: Is Dinah to be treated as a whore, Zonah? Can she be allowed to be taken out of wedlock by a foreigner? In the context of the honor shame sociocultural milieu, the daughter's voice hardly matters. Even when the Hivites are willing to remove the Israelite symbol of disgrace, the foreskin, from their male bodies in order to intermarry with Jacob's family, their status as the tainted, ineluctable other remains. So I just think it's an interesting story. I mean, it's certainly very different from the rest of the other ones that we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to start with Dinah because it's sort of a counter example. So we're going to move on. Well, I mean, I do want to ask, how do you think Dinah felt about her predicament? She's not given a voice in the story whatsoever. So if you put yourself in her shoes, we don't really, like I said, we don't necessarily know whether she was willing or not when it comes to her relationship with Shechem. But I imagine, at least from my perspective, I always sort of imagined that it would have had to be extremely traumatic no matter what, because either she loved him and they wanted to marry, and her brothers killed her husband, or she was raped and he tried to win her over. But I still think it would be very traumatic to still like witness all that violence around her and all of that sort of being done on her behalf. If
Well, that's part of your statement about her being an object,
yeah,
because we don't care about how she feels.
right.
She was a deus machina, in other
Duse
words,
machina. Yeah.
yeah, she just
Yep.
appears she was used.
Yeah. Any other comments?
Who was Rachav married to, supposedly? Because that's
Who?
another one. Rachav in Joshua's story. The
Uh,
Zonah.
But
yes.
how could she be married to anyone because
I thought she was a widow. I don't know who she was married to.
They
at
had put
least
her
in the
in
Talmud it says that men who even said her name ejaculated. How could she be married to someone because he'd spend his whole life dehydrated?
Are you talking about Rachel again?
Yeah, isn't that what
Yeah.
Sheila just asked about?
yeah.
I
Rob?
haven't read that part, but I do know she's like I don't think a husband is mentioned when she comes
No,
into the
it's in a
story.
part of Midrash because everybody who's mentioned, they always like
Sure.
Miriam doesn't have a husband. So I think they
Well,
put
like not it's
Bezalel.
not a husband that's mentioned. It's interesting that if
Yeah,
she
it's
did
like,
have a
but
husband that
they
he
say
wouldn't have been mentioned.
Bezalel was her husband. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah, there's a certain amount that we have to read into things. That's
We
where
can't,
Midrash
we're
comes in.
not allowed to, they're not allowed to be women who do not have, well, that's not true because Yael doesn't have a husband. Or does she? If we certainly don't pay attention to it.
Well, we are going to talk it towards the end. We are going to talk about Judith, who, Yael and Judith, it's an interesting parallels um, because Yael and
Yes,
Sisera
come to think of
versus,
it.
yeah.
Yeah,
So we'll
that
talk
is
about,
interesting.
yeah, we will talk about that at the end. I'm going to move on for the sake of time. So the Tamar that I want to talk about is the Tamar of Tamar and Judah. So this is like the earlier Tamar because um, Tamar and Amnon was mentioned, and they were half siblings, offspring of David, King David. But this is the earlier Tamar. So she was Judah's daughter-in-law. She was married to his eldest and then his middle sons. Um, and then both of whom died without issue. She was supposed to then marry his youngest son, but Judah keeps her in limbo. I think the superstition sort of comes out that look, she was married to my eldest, he died. She was married to my middle son, he died. Is she like jinxed? Like what's like if I marry her to my youngest son, is he gonna die too? Like that was probably. I mean, actually, I'm pretty sure the Torah actually even says that that's what's his concern. But he could have just sort of released her, and he didn't do that. Right. So she's kind of kept in limbo back in her parents' house. She then takes matters into her own hands. Um, so we know that she kind of dallies by the side of the road. She veils herself so that he won't recognize her, and he thinks that she's a prostitute, and goes to her for her services. He gives her his staff and seal as a pledge to pay for payment for the exchange that they had sex. And he goes to make good on his payment later. He asks the servants to find that prostitute who was out there, and they said there was not. We can't find we can't find the prostitute you mentioned, right? They can't find her, because that's not who she was. Not a prostitute. She was by the side of the road, right? She becomes pregnant, and Judah hears that she's pregnant, and that she should be punished because that's unchaste, and that's not considered proper or acceptable in those times. So he calls for her to be burned at the stake, basically, and she then fetches the staff and the seal and says, "The man who gave these to me is from whom I'm pregnant." And he realizes, okay, so that's my bad. I am the father. He owns up to it. I mean, it's kind of a crazy story. I'm actually going to stop the share again here. I have an article to share. Certainly, by the way, I mean, the sort of relationship, but the relationship between a father-in-law and daughter-in-law, a father-in-law, daughter-in-law is not is sort of not, it's not considered like one of the relationships that would be particularly um lauded or is desirable. It's crazy though, because we see all kinds of stories with potentially half siblings, and um Yocheved was the aunt of her husband. I mean, you see close relationships all the time. Um, but apparently father-in-law, daughter-in-law, not so great. So the
But
fact, so
prostitution is okay.
that's true.
That is
Apparently that was
shocking.
okay. Apparently that was okay. That would have been okay. Um, but at any rate, so the point of it is though that he never has relations with her again. He doesn't marry her or anything like that. She just has the status, and he accepts, her twin sons that are born from that union as his heirs. So that's sort of the outcome of that here. I'm gonna share with you the next.
Interesting when you think about it.
Yeah.
Mary and Joseph produce the Messiah, Jesus, and Joseph claims that he was descended from, it's Joseph was from, whatever, David and whatnot.
Well, yeah. So she is
There's
a
there's
progenitor of David.
yeah, there's a parallel there.
Okay. She ultimately tricks Judah into impregnating her, therefore secures her place in the family. She gives Judah two sons, and her story illustrates her loyalty and her willingness to be assertive and unconventional. So I'm gonna kind of scroll down because we did talk about a few of these. Um, Although the readers know that God has killed two of Judah's sons, Judah does not. He suspects that Tamar is a lethal woman, a woman whose sexual partners are all doomed to die. So Judah is afraid to give Tamar to his youngest son, Shelah. As a result, Judah wrongs Tamar. According to Near Eastern custom known from Middle Assyrian laws, if a man has no son over 10 years old, he could perform the Levirate marriage obligation himself. If he does not, the woman is declared a widow, free to marry again. Judah, who is perhaps afraid of Tamar's lethal character, could have set her free, but he does not. He sends her to live as a widow in her father's house, but unlike with other widows, she cannot remarry and must stay chaste on pain of death. She's in limbo. So the story really outlines the fact that Tamar is in the right, and it's actually Judah who's in the wrong, interestingly. So ostensibly, Tamar's only waiting for Shelah to grow up and mate with her, but after time passes, she realizes that Judah is not going to affect that union. She therefore devises a plan to secure her own future by tricking her father-in-law into having sex with her. She is not planning incest. A father-in-law may not sleep with his daughter-in-law, just as a brother-in-law may not sleep with his sister-in-law. But in in-law, incest rules are suspended for the purpose of levirate. The levir, after all, is only a surrogate for the dead husband. So we know they talked about this part already. So I do
There
want to
are a
point this
lot
out
of
because this is odd.
excuses. There are a lot of excuses for disregarding what we consider later laws.
Sure, of course.
It's very, yeah.
Yeah. So Tamar's place in the family and Judah's posterity are secured. She gives birth to twins, Perez and Zerah, thus restoring two sons to Judah, who has lost two. Their birth is reminiscent of the birth of Rebekah's twin sons, at which Jacob comes out holding Esau's heel. Perez does him one better. The midwife marks Zerah's hand with a scarlet cord when it emerges from the womb first, but Perez, whose name means barrier breach, edges his way through. From his line would come David. I want to point out that it was clearly not a woman who wrote that, who wrote that into the story, because I mean that's not how birth works. Once they're kind of down into the birth canal, there's no switch out. You can't really switch places. They're ready to be birthed. So but Tamar was assertive of her rights and subversive of convention. She was also deeply loyal to Judah's family. These qualities also show up in Ruth, who we'll also talk about, who appears later in the lineage of Perez and preserves Boaz as part of that line. So it's interesting that I'm gonna come back to the presentation here. So instead of being punished for sexual impropriety or being overly forward, Tamar is lauded as an example of feminine empowerment and becomes part of the Davidic line through her son Perez. So this is I think this is one of our earliest sort of examples of women in the Tanakh using their sexuality for good. I mean, for power, and because she had out of a deep sense of loyalty, obligation, she knows that she is supposed to be part of this line, and so she takes the initiative upon herself to right that wrong, and to show Judah that he needed to own up. So we're gonna move on to the next one. So the very next one I want to talk about is Ruth. So she decides to stay with her mother-in-law Naomi and with her people, converting from being Moabite. I want to point out also that the perspective of the book of Ruth is special. It is, I think, just about the only example in the whole of Tanakh that has a feminine second person plural. Shovna, return my daughters, right? That's what Naomi says to Ruth and Orpah. And Orpah does. One of the sources that I read also kind of pointed out that it was interesting that Naomi said, "Return to the house of your mothers." She didn't say to the house of your fathers, which was sort of more of the convention in other places in the Tanakh. So there is a lot of, I think, feminine perspective, especially in the book of Ruth. She then attracts the attention of Naomi's kinsman Boaz, who owns wheat fields which are being harvested. So this is in the aftermath, of course, that Ruth, her husband dies and both her sons die, and they're sort of penniless, and so they go back to the land that Ruth is from. So obviously in Israel, yeah, Sheila.
He attracts the attention only once Boaz is told, or she's told, that Boaz is your relative.
Boaz actually he knows that she is he can tell that she is not of their people,
She's
that
not,
she's a
yeah, the
stranger.
rest of the people, yeah.
She's gleaning in sort of the fields, and he's like, "Who's this woman?" And he asks after her. He is intrigued by her and asks who she is. So he realizes that he, I think, has a connection with her, but he was attracted to her right away. He noticed her.
It's about time he got married. he was
Huh?
he was much older when
That's
this
true.
all happened.
Yeah. And then upon Naomi's advice, Ruth sneaks into where he's sleeping on the threshing floor, and it's sort of unclear just quite what happens, but it leads to their marriage and also to Ruth being part of the Davidic line. So I am actually going to also stop the share and come back to another article here. The story of, what goes down on that threshing floor, it's kind of interesting. So let's see. I have two articles here. I don't know if I want to have time for both. Actually, I think I do have time for both. So let me start with this one. And does anybody here? Let me share first. Does anybody want to read? No?
Right, I'll read if you want.
Go ahead. Thank you.
The Book of Ruth gives the impression of being a simple, charming folk tale, but don't be fooled. Its author was one of the finest literary stylists in the Bible. Yet she managed to turn this episode from the genealogy of King David into an enduring work of literature. Careful readers, though, will see what ancient Israelite readers saw, the tenuous chain of events that turned Ruth into David's great-grandmother. If just one of the many links in that chain had broken, there would have been no King David. Many reversals of expected gender norms suggest strongly that this author was a woman. For example, Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah to return to the mother's house, not the father's house. Perhaps that's why one of these moments when history didn't happen, centered around an incident of what today we would call sexual harassment in the workplace. The story in a nutshell is that Naomi, a woman from Bethlehem, moves to Moab with her husband and 2 sons. The sons marry Moabite girls, but then all 3 men die. When Naomi decides to move home, the girls decide to come with her. She tells them to go home, and the other daughter-in-law, Orpah, turns back. Naomi tries again to persuade Ruth to go home, but fails. When they arrive in Bethlehem, they're penniless, but it is the time of the barley harvest, and Ruth can support them by gleaning. Explains any stalks of
Any
grain that
stalks
the
of grain?
reapers drop or forget are considered ownerless and must be left for the poor to collect. She goes out to find a field where she'll be allowed to do this. Here and elsewhere, the rules we know from the Torah are taken as cultural background rather than law. And as luck would have it, she finds herself in the field belonging to Boaz. Boaz shows up, asks his foreman who that girl is, and he says she's the Moabite who came back with Naomi. But as he goes on speaking, the foreman's Hebrew becomes more difficult to understand. Something's making him nervous. Boaz's response tells us immediately what has been happening. Then Boaz says to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one. Keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them." I mean, where do these young women, who are
So
these
there
young
are
women?
other women out gleaning in the fields.
But he says they're my young women.
They're like they're his workers. I mean, like they're his sort of his from his kinsfolk.
Okay.
He
I have
notices that she's a stranger, and he advises her to keep close to his people and that she'll be safer if she does that because
I have ordered the
it's sort of
young men not,
indicating that she could kind of be a little bit molested by as being a stranger if she
yeah,
kind of goes in other fields.
makes sense. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. I mean, men, women, they're used sort of interchangeable. It's very interesting.
Hmm.
Why is it first the women stay with my women, but the men aren't going to touch you, but they'll get you water?
Hmm.
It is. I never noticed that before, but anyway, these words make clear that Ruth was on her way out of the field when Boaz showed up. She's poor, without a male protector, and most important in this story, a foreigner, making her easy to victimize. But she was tired of being groped and had decided to look for a safer place to work. Had Boaz stayed in town for one more cup of coffee, Ruth would have been gone and they would not have met, married, and produced David's grandfather. Ruth shows Boaz making sure that Ruth can get something to eat at noon and still remain safe. But like today, other women were unmarried, poor, and foreign didn't have it so easy. Sexual harassment is a plot twist, not a social issue, but it's a realistic one. And we may wonder, was the author of the book writing from personal experience? Wow.
So it's an interesting start to sort of analyzing Ruth. I am going to share, we have another article here, um, which I don't think we're going to get into the whole thing, but it talks a little bit more about the sort of how murky it is of just what happened, because some people like to think that the euphemism of what Ruth does. Like, was there any sort of sexual activity between Ruth and Boaz on the threshing floor? It certainly is debatable, right? So here I want to talk about okay, let's go from here for a second. Boaz is fascinated by Ruth from the moment he sees her, even before he knows who she is, and his interest in her increases upon acquaintance. However, after the barley harvest ends, after around 3 months, Boaz made Ruth no offer of marriage. Naomi suggests to Ruth that they need to take matters into their own hands. Um, Rabbinic sources agree that there was no premarital sex between Ruth and Boaz. Ruth Rabbah, for example, states that Boaz showed greater restraint than Jacob's son Joseph when Joseph was propositioned by his master's wife. Yet many Bible interpreters disagree with the rabbis on this point, including Josephus. Also, evidence seems to indicate the possibility that a sexual encounter occurred. So here's some of the evidence. Naomi tells Ruth that they need to find rest for her, meaning security, and security at that time was achieved for women by marriage. She tells Ruth to go to Boaz at night when he is sleeping on the threshing floor. If the purpose was simply to talk, why was she told to go at night, and why while he was sleeping? She instructs her to wash herself, anoint herself, which is putting on perfume, and dress in her best clothes. This is usually not needed for a conversation. The only other time that the three instructions are used in scripture is in Ezekiel in regard to preparation for marriage. Although Rashi did not think Ruth and Boaz had a sexual encounter, he interprets the text to mean that Naomi suggested that Ruth wear her best Sabbath clothing. Although Naomi told Ruth to clothe herself before going to the threshing floor, Ruth put on the special clothes after she arrived because if I go all decorated, whoever meets me and sees me will say I'm a prostitute. All right, so she is like sort of dressing in her best. She's getting all dressed up, gussied up. She didn't want anybody else to see her and think she's a prostitute. Naomi suggests that Ruth should not make herself known to Boaz until after he has finished eating and drinking. Is she suggesting that Ruth wait until Boaz is intoxicated? Gersonides interprets, do not make yourself known to the man as do not let anyone see you going to the field tonight. And so here's the part which talks about the euphemism. So Ruth should then see where Boaz lies down and then go in and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. Is the uncovering of his feet a euphemism? The root used here and translated as feet is marglotav, bearing the root resh gimel lamed, foot, regel. However, the term only appears in the Bible in regard to the unique feet or lower extremity of an angel in Daniel 10:16, where Daniel describes a vision he had of an angel that did not look like a human. Isaiah uses the usual word for feet and states that he saw a vision in which an angel covered his face and feet with wings. Why did the angel need to cover his feet? Is it possible that Naomi, or the author of the tale, is using this form of feet as a euphemism for penis? If not, why does Naomi instruct her to uncover his feet? If the purpose was to alert Boaz that she was present, wouldn't it make more sense to uncover the upper part of his body? So this is interesting. So the euphemism, and I honestly, even if you're not aware of the euphemism of feet, if you're reading it, it really does seem like you could interpret that there is euphemism there because just the way it's described in the story. So let's see. I'm gonna skip that one. It
There's an
wasn't
awful
until
lot
around
of
midnight
sex
that
in the
Boaz.
Bible.
What was that?
There's an awful lot of sex in the Bible.
Oh, sure, of course. Or knowing.
Yeah, knowing.
Yeah.
Entering. Yeah, he knew him.
It isn't until around midnight that Boaz wakens and is startled to find a woman lying at his feet. Why didn't he awaken when Ruth lay beside him? If one overindulges in alcohol, one frequently awakens in the middle of the night when much of the effects of the drink wears off. Ruth identifies herself to Boaz and adds, spread your coat over your handmaid, for you are a near kinsman. This reminds us
Hi,
of the
Grace.
Joseph
This is
story.
Linda Schoenberg. You just tried calling me, and
I'm
I'm
mute you. For you are near kinsman. This reminds us of Joseph escapes the clutches of his master's wife, but she grabs his coat and holds onto it since he avoided having sex with her. Here, Ruth is saying the opposite. Spread your coat over your handmaid. Does the narrator want us to understand that contrary to Joseph, Ruth is asking for sex, or is she asking for protection? So that part's a little unclear. We're supposed to recall the story of Tamar and Judah. We talked about the Levirate marriage, right? And Boaz can perform Levirate duty. Some of the story, when you read it, it's sort of clear that Boaz does like her, but I think he sort of is either a little bit shy or he feels like he doesn't want to overstep. Like there might be other kinsmen who would be a closer Levirate match, right? Who might be a closer kinsman than he is. Or if he's a little older, would you even want him, right? So some of that is sort of the background of what's holding him up. Let's see. So that we already did talk about Tamar, so we'll skip that one. Boaz tells Ruth that he will do what she wants and says, tarry here tonight. Why did he want Ruth to remain? Should we understand that he was not concerned with her returning home at night, given that she left hours later while it was still dark before one could recognize another person? why did Boaz warn her to let it not be known that the women came to the threshing floor, right? So they keep that part a little secret. Boaz gives Ruth a gift when she left the threshing floor to return home, and this reminds readers of the gift that Judah gave to Tamar after he had sex with her. When Ruth returned home, Naomi asked her, "Who are you, my daughter?" Was Naomi inquiring whether Ruth was now engaged to Boaz as a result of the encounter? Ruth did not tell Naomi what Boaz said. She told her all that the man had done to her. Needless to say, every one of these facts can be interpreted in an innocuous way. So it really sort of does. It really is up to interpretation. Plenty of rabbis have said that there was nothing untoward, but it does seem like like it sort of left things open ended that you could interpret that. So
What would be
it's an
interesting is
interesting
which
story.
rabbis interpret it that it didn't take place, like,
A
the more
few. Rashi was
traditional,
one of the ones who was mentioned,
the
and some of
traditional
the
ones. Whereas
yes.
today
Oh yeah,
we are
plenty of
reading,
rabbis today would say. Yeah, yeah. I mean, some I meant the rabbi sages of more ancient times than now. That's a fair point. Um, so it sort of does bear some resemblance to Tamar's story, and you can see there are connections. What were Ruth's motivations for acting as she did? What do we think?
we wanted to have descendants. She also
Mm-hmm.
did, she's taking care of Ruth. She wants, if she has Boaz, first of all, Boaz has some money,
Mm-hmm.
and Ruth will be taken care of. She'll be taken care of,
Ruth and
and then
Naomi will
maybe
be
there
taken
will
care of.
be a
Yeah.
future.
Okay. Keep in mind too, like, she was taking quite a risk, I think a gamble of sort of the unknown when she decided to go with Naomi, her mother-in-law, because she went to a foreign land where she didn't know anybody except her mother-in-law, and they were
Which is,
penniless and really
that's also
relying
very
on
interesting why I mean, Orpah goes back, but only after thinking about it.
yes.
She's also thinking, hey, it's like we say that women like to marry Jewish men because they have a better living. They can provide a better living. I
Sure.
mean, when you think about it, things haven't changed.
Well, I think she I don't think she knew for sure what was. I think she knew that there could be the possibility if she goes with Naomi that they'll find another kinsperson for levirate marriage. I also wonder how much levirate marriage was known to other peoples. I wonder because that's like something that's Jewish law. Is that something that would typically be undertaken? Like, did the Moabites have anything like that? Would she have known about that?
Well,
I'm not entirely sure.
maybe the Moabites wouldn't have accepted her because her husband died. There is a feeling,
It could be.
even
Yeah,
amongst
we don't really
people,
know too much about Moabite customs from those
you
times.
don't,
That's a fair point.
well, even today,
But Orpah went back.
you don't want to marry someone whose wife died because it's like bad luck. A few years ago, I remember, I do know people like that.
Well,
That
I
used to
think
be
that's the
what,
reason why Judah didn't want to marry Tamar to his third
right?
son.
Yeah. You also didn't move into an apartment where somebody had died.
Oh, yeah, that's a
This was
superstition
the
sort of
thing.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
nothing changes.
Yeah. So on the one hand, it's on the one hand it's financial motivation. On the other hand, she feels, I think, obligated to Naomi because, I mean, if you think about how the story would have gone for Naomi if Ruth had listened to her and left, what sort of options would Naomi have then had on her own? I saw Round's hand was raised first.
Is it possible that, although we're not told, that Ruth was a prophetess and she knew she had to go back because I don't know how much she knew, but she knew she had to go back. Maybe she knew that she was going to be the great grandmother of the future king.
I wouldn't consider it outside the realm of possibility. She does hold a special place in the line, and she's sort of, even though there were converts before her, she's sort of the first official named convert. than we have an example of in Tanakh. We know that when we hear about converts and mixed multitudes but she's the one who's named, and she says, where you go, I will go. Your people will be your people. Your God will be my God. Right? Like she says that, and maybe she does feel an affinity or a connection to Judaism and to God, or maybe it's just to Naomi. Maybe they're I mean, the story doesn't describe that, but I wouldn't consider it outside the realm of possibility. I saw Judy had a hand raised too. Did you want to add
Yeah,
something?
two things. Well, one was what Ron just said. I was going to question whether she is
Yeah.
whether she's considered a prophetess. But the other thing is the last part of what you read, the quote, where the ambiguous one about she comes back and she actually, but it says the Megillah that she tells Ruth,
All that was done
tells
to her
Naomi all that happened.
was done to her.
Yeah, so there wasn't that much to tell, so that's why it's like still questionable to me.
Or like maybe there was more than what was in the story that she could then tell to Naomi. Yeah.
I
Like I
also
said,
got,
it's very open for interpretation. Norma?
yeah, I got the feeling that Ruth kind of sized him up right away, and he was a gentle soul, and he didn't
Yes.
take advantage of her. And it sounds like she had been taken advantage of in a prior time,
Yes.
and she was looking to be safe, and
Yeah.
she felt a safeness with him, and so she was going to go after it.
Yes. I would say you can certainly consider the story of Ruth and Boaz as like a very unconventional sort of love story. That you don't see a lot of examples like Boaz, where he, can seem like he's like this, big, strong man, but he's very gentle, very kind, and he cares a lot. And, even though it's clear that he kind of wanted Ruth from the start, he didn't
He held back.
he didn't take that leap right away. He wanted
Right.
to be respectful of her wishes and of her best prospects. He wasn't sure that he was the best prospect for her. That's like one of the biggest reasons, I think, why he sort of held back until she then took that initiative and he knew that she wanted him, right? So it's interesting. I'm gonna move on now unless anyone has anything to add. All right, so I want to talk about Bathsheba. So we know that she had a relationship with King David while her husband Uriah was away at war after David spied her bathing on the roof, right? In terms of had a relationship, it's very simplistic, the way it's laid out in the Tanakh, where he's, first of all, I want to point out that David is, the story is more illustrative of David's mistakes and harmful actions than it is of her alluring nature or her power or sexuality. It's really more about his own impropriety because, first of all, he's the king and he is staying home from war. He's not out among his troops whatsoever. He's home taking a nap, and he gazes out and he sees this woman and knows that she is married to his general and still summons for her and has sex with her, knowing full well that it's adultery. And the fact that he was even home in the first place from war put him into the position of making that mistake. So it starts out with she starts out with very little agency, but she does go on to have more as she becomes wife to King David. So sort of she only basically speaks two words in the beginning of the story. So after we don't know if first of all if she was willing or not. I like to assume that she was. He's the king, so on a certain level, I imagine it would have been difficult to say no to him. I am going to actually stop the share and come to another article here. Okay. So here, I'm going to illustrate this to you. in terms of the level of agency that she has in the story, which is pretty minimal at first. So, David, who remains in the palace while his troops are deployed at war, spies a woman bathing from his rooftop after a late afternoon siesta. So against the background of the siege of the Ammonite town, Rabbah, the battle occasions Bathsheba's husband Uriah's absence from home and the adultery his summons from the front to cover for the resultant pregnancy and his eventual death. The contrast between David and Uriah implies a searing critique of the king's power when the corrupt king takes his loyal soldier's wife to bed. So Bathsheba is first introduced by name when the king sends messengers to inquire after the woman who report, "Is this not Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Her father and husband are both members of David's elite vanguard. Her grandfather Ahithophel, father of Eliam, is one of the king's wisest counselors, who later betrays David in line with Absalom. Despite her status as a married woman and the illustrious men with whom she is affiliated, David summons her for his pleasure. So David sent her messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. And she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent word to David and said, "I am pregnant." So that's like the only thing she says is, "I am pregnant." In Hebrew, it's so Bathsheba's role in this verse, few terse lines, reveals very little of her feeling or character. She plays an almost entirely passive role in this chapter and utters only 3 words, but it's 2 in Hebrew. The parenthetical aside about her purifying herself may refer back to the roof bath as a ritual cleansing at the end of her period, which would affirm David's paternity. Alternatively, the purification takes place after they lie together and eludes the ritual of cleansing following sexual relations. Yet Bathsheba cannot wash herself of the consequences, and a month or 2 later she is compelled to send word that she is pregnant. She alone carries the results of the tryst in her body. Did Bathsheba lie with the king willingly? Some readers suggest that she deliberately positions herself on the roof, bathing naked within David's purview, so that he would take her and make her one of his wives, and thus she would perhaps bear the future king. It seems, however, that he only wants her for that one time. She alone risks the death penalty for adultery, given her husband's absence, the resulting pregnancy, and the king's absolute power. Others suggest that she's raped since she has no wherewithal to resist the king's summons, though the language does not imply force. As the story unravels, the narrative seems to exonerate Bathsheba of any guilt and is exclusively concerned with the king's degeneracy. While David has no intention of continuing the liaison, the pregnancy embroils him. To David's credit, he does not deny his role in the conception. In order to cover for his paternity and free Bathsheba from suspicion of adultery, he summons Uriah from the front to sleep with his wife. But the soldier repeatedly refuses to go to his house, swearing loyalty to the troops. David then sends him back to the front with a letter to the general Joab to set Uriah up to be slain in battle. After hearing of Uriah's death, Bathsheba laments over him. David waits the requisite mourning period and then summons her to become his wife. She bears him a son, the progeny of their illicit union, yet the thing was evil in the eyes of the Lord. So I want to point out that the pregnancy that resulted from that union, in terms of the story, the way the story indicates, is that that child, that baby, did not survive. Um, so it was only later afterwards, after they mourned the loss of that child, that Solomon was their next one. Because he did take her as his wife in order to make things right, but he did also arrange for her husband to be killed in battle. It's a pretty complicated story. Nathan the prophet is then sent to the king to rebuke him and awaken his conscience by way of a parable. Though David confesses and repents, he suffers the consequences of his sins. The sword will never leave his house, and another man will possess his wives in public. So this goes on to sort of talk about, I mean, we know David's life was full of strife, lots of infighting among his wives and children. We talked about a little bit earlier about his daughter Tamar being raped by his Amnon, his firstborn son. They were half siblings. And then the murder of Amnon by the next in line to the throne, Absalom. We know Absalom battled against his father for the throne and was not the only one to do that. So it does mention that David did elaborately mourn the infant son who perished. We only hear of Bathsheba's response when he turns to console her. This is the one time she is identified as his wife. Throughout the rest of the story, she is referred to as wife of Uriah. In these early scenes, Bathsheba is almost without agency, merely a married woman and the object of the king's lust. Yet, Bathsheba plays a more active role in guaranteeing that her second son becomes successor to the throne. So first of all, it points out that the name Solomon, Shlomo, suggests well-being or wholeness. So that intimates like a royal future. We see here an early alliance between Bathsheba and Natan, the prophet, who gives the child a second name, Yedidyah, meaning friend or beloved of God. Indeed, this son will become heir to the crown and build the temple in Jerusalem. In the opening chapters of the Book of Kings, Bathsheba plays an active role to ensure that her son is designated heir to the throne. David, feeble with old age, does not know that his son Adoniah, the presumptive heir, has set himself up as king. Nor does he know, in the biblical sense, the beautiful young woman Abishag who lies with him to keep him warm. And the text explicitly says that, by the way. Far from his former self, the king has declined into sexual and political impotence. Nathan then colludes with Bathsheba to remind David of his oath to her to make Solomon, their son, king, though no oath is recorded earlier in the biblical account. My lord, you yourself swore by the Lord your God, your handmaids, saying, indeed, Solomon your son shall reign as king after me, and he shall sit on my throne. She then emphasizes the danger she and her son are in, given their exclusion from Adoniah's alliance. When Nathan corroborates her words, David in turn swears in the name of God and Israel to make Solomon king. So she basically sets her son up. So even though in the beginning she didn't really have much agency in terms of what happened when she was married to Uriah, the general. Certainly after she becomes David's wife, and we know he had many wives, and there was a lot of infighting among everybody, but certainly once she was in that circumstance, she did have more agency. So she helped secure the throne for her son Solomon. And it could be that she sort of uses maybe she uses her sexuality, maybe she just uses logic and appeals to logic. She certainly uses alliance because, like it said in the article, she really allied herself with the prophet Nathan. So she uses power and influence to get the throne for Solomon. Certainly among all of David's children, he is sort of the one who is sort of deemed the most fit to inherit the throne. A lot of trouble and issues with a lot of the other children, and the fact that they all wanted to kind of take the throne before David even had died or decided to give the throne to pass the throne on. So that's Bathsheba. Now I want to talk about Judith, and I first want to point out that this technically really is no longer in the realm of Tanakh. The book of Judith, the book of Maccabees, like the Hanukkah story, those are things that happen later after Tanakh is sort of canonized. So the book of Maccabees, the book of Judith are not part of Tanakh, but they are still part of Jewish literature, the Jewish story. So I do want to bring them up because I think, especially now, given that we're in the midst of Hanukkah, I think it's important to bring up this part of the story. So this is, by the way, a very famous picture of Judith and Holofernes. And we did mention earlier a little bit about Yael and Sisera. So those two stories are very similar parallels. We know Judith was a young widow. She gradually gained the trust of enemy Syrian Greek general Holofernes by feigning her support of and interest in him. So she flirted with him, and over time, he grew to trust her, and his soldiers knew her, recognized her, and let her into the camp. So she could come and go without any fear. And so she was sort of talking to him and flirting with him and indicating that she was interested and that she was on his side and that she was feeding him intel about her neighbors that they were in siege against, and that they would eventually she would tell them when the siege reached a point where they could easily overtake the Jews, because it would be clear when that they had given up, that they were ready to they would be easily beaten if they were kind of starved out, and to the point that they would even eat non-kosher animals. That's sort of the way the story goes. So he was attracted to her, and she seduced him, feeding him wine and cheese to get him to sleep before stealing his sword and beheading him, which routed his army and led to victory for the Jews. So this story is connected to Hanukkah, and I want to give a brief plug for Chag Habanot, which is the Festival of the Daughters. It is a Mizrahi custom that takes place typically on the 6th or sometimes 7th night of Hanukkah, intersecting with Rosh Chodesh, and often celebrating Judith by eating wine and cheese. So she's credited as being a big part of the Maccabean victory. It doesn't explicitly say that this was part of the same battle, but it can definitely be inferred that there are connections between the battle that is talked about there and the battle, the war that was being fought by the Maccabees, to the eventual victory and winning back of the Holy Temple, the continuation of Judaism itself, because we know that in that time, by the way, a lot of the Jews of those time were willing to assimilate and go with the way of the land, and sort of turn away from Judaism, and that would have been very disastrous. And so it's entirely possible that having Judaism today is a result of that Maccabean victory. So Judith plays a role in that. So her story is connected to Hanukkah, and I think it's wonderful that we can celebrate her role and the role of the women who really took the lead in helping to clean out and rededicate the temple. Then there's also Hannah, and not the Hannah that we talked about already, the Hannah, who prayed for a child, the sort of introduced prayer. She was praying silently. But this Hannah is a different Hannah. So during Seleucid assimilation for the Jews, there was a custom that brides were required to spend their wedding night with the Greek governor. Some may have heard of similar customs like that existing under certain empires. So was purportedly a custom that existed in those times. Obviously, that's incredibly problematic. So Hannah is the sister of the Maccabees. She brazenly stood up before her wedding guests and challenged them, her brothers and their guests, to protect her honor. And she reportedly did this by stripping naked and pointing out that she might as well be naked in public if she's forced into rape by the Greek governor. So she really woke them up to the fact that this was common practice, and she said, "Why are we doing this? This is not okay. I do not want to be spending my wedding night with the Greek governor. This is not this is completely unjust, and we shouldn't stand for it." And she makes a good point, and she convinces them. So then her brothers attacked and killed the governor, leading the revolt to become a full-fledged war in large part. So it's in large part due to Hannah's part of the story, which is very little known, but certainly she took it upon herself to stand up for that and to force the men to confront what was happening, and that any victory that was won was really after the Maccabees stood up against those practices that were becoming common for them in that land under Seleucid rule. So definitely kind of a crucial point in the story. She doesn't really have her own book like Judith, but she is part of the Hanukkah story, and certainly a woman who used her sexuality, but the power of that to sort of convince her family to fight for a sense of justice. Before I move on, are there any comments about Judith or Hannah? All right, so I have one more here. It's an interesting one. I want to point out negative depictions of women's power and sexuality. So there are two really big ones that come to mind. The first is Jezebel. You know that name. It's used today as a negative word for women, right? So who was Jezebel? She was a Phoenician royal, the wife of King Ahab, he was the ruler of Israel in those times. She interfered with the proper worship for God by introducing other gods and forms of worship. So, like I think she introduced like a nature god and the Baal worshippers and foreign fires. Like she definitely sort of had lots of opinions on that and played a role in that, which is certainly not the way of the Israelite kingdom before that. So she also interfered with the safety of the prophet Elijah, because he was very much against the practices that she was attempting to institute. So he spoke out against them, and he sort of also went about proving false prophets to be false from those other deities and worshiping rites. So she sort of saw him as an enemy, and she kind of persecuted him and made him sort of flee because he was worried for his safety. And she is sort of at least partially to blame for the weakening of the kingdom of Israel. So she's definitely viewed in a very negative light. She definitely took on more power than a woman, I think, would be expected to in those times. And perhaps she used her sexuality, perhaps she used her beauty and her appeal. I think that is sort of the implication from the story to sort of get King Ahab to kind of go along with her bidding, right? So he kind of gave her a lot more power, a lot more free reign than I think anyone would have expected a king of Israel to give their wife. I'm not sure if he had other wives or not. Like, it still was common practice in those days. We know David and Solomon both had a lot of wives and concubines, but unclear about the time of Ahab. But I just want to point out, though, that like she clearly has a lot more power and agency than was expected for a woman in those times, and it's clearly depicted in the story as something negative. And the other example also that comes to mind is Delilah, famous Delilah from Samson and Delilah. So she was a Philistine convert. She married Samson, who was a mighty Nazarite warrior. She then accepted bribes from the Philistines to betray Samson. So Samson was kind of like a thorn in the side of the Philistines. He was incredibly strong, owing to his connection to God. He was a Nazarite. His hair had never been cut. That was sort of viewed as the root, like sort of the cause of his strength, was that he was dedicated as a Nazarite, and part of that was never shaving, never cutting his hair. But even though she converted and she married him, she was easily sort of bribed to completely betray him. And then Samson is punished for trusting her, right? So he was sort of lured in by her. And she's not actually the only example that he tried to marry a different Philistine woman before that, and it didn't end up working out. And there was also one other foreign woman that he also had a relationship with. So you could sort of read into those stories that Samson's story is like sort of a parable warning of the dangers of intermarriage, and it would hardly be the first time that there are stories like that in the Tanakh. But certainly Delilah is viewed very negatively. She's viewed as having lured him in and with her beauty and her charms, and then turns around and betrays him. So, any thoughts about these stories and the negative depictions of power and sexuality? Yeah, Judy.
I would add, on behalf of all women, to this list of the negative, Chava, because we have labor because of her, and
That's
we're
a good
not
point.
in Gan
We
Eden
did talk
because
about
of
that in the
her.
first class, but yes, that's a fair point. It certainly, I mean, but that depends. We did talk about the two creation stories, and it's really the second one that kind of relies more on that. But yes, that's a fair point. You could sort of consider that as a negative. I don't think that her power and sexuality were quite as prominent yet in that part of the story. But it's an interesting thought. Anyone else have anything to add? Anything about Jezebel, Delilah? Anything else that comes to mind?
So I have a question. Philistine
Yeah.
convert, what does a Philistine do? I mean, like what are you converting from?
Well,
Like,
Philistines were a people that were native to the area during
right.
those times, and they certainly had a lengthy, difficult history with the Israelites. Um, Definitely lots of battles, kind of back and forth. And so Samson was sort of like a warrior who kind of stood up for the Israelites and kind of batted down the Philistines. By the way, the fact that that exists, that history exists with the Philistines, is why the name Palestine was later given to Israel by the Romans. That they took by the way, the Philistines are, we don't know who that people doesn't exist anymore as far as anything can be traced. So so they kind of revived that name just to kind of stick it to the Judeans. Um, but yeah, so certainly though we know there was lots of kind of enmity between the peoples, and there were some positive relationships too. That can kind of be that was kind of the case of all the peoples back then. That there were sort of back and forth. Sometimes it's skirmishes, sometimes it's intermarriage, and you don't know kind of what it's gonna be. But even though Samson was frequently depicted as fighting against Philistines, he still went to marry one. Actually, it was the second Philistine woman he married or tried to marry. But it does sort of mention in the text like the idea of conversion before they married. And I think that is probably in part due to like the idea of purity because he's a Nazarite. Um, and by the way, it doesn't really even mention children, but I think there are some sources that postulate that they did have children. So that part is interesting because it's not really mentioned. But you can assume probably that other peoples that lived around, the Judeans or the Jews, Israelites, like during those times, would not have been monotheistic like Jews are. Wouldn't have had the same laws. Wouldn't would it have a completely separate culture and understanding of the world. That's sort of the way I would take that. But it doesn't really say much, I don't think, about who the Philistines were. So you can sort of take a sort of a view, like a historical view, and just sort of understand lots of different peoples are mentioned as having conflict with Israelites in those times and before. So you can just sort of kind of apply the same situation, but it's the different people. Anyone else have anything to add about Jezebel and Delilah? If you haven't noticed, I want to kind of point out that these are negative depictions, and what they have in common is that they are not Jewish women. Not originally, at least. They marry a Jewish man, and maybe they convert, maybe they don't, but they are depicted, so their sexuality, their power is a negative. But meanwhile, when it's like a Jewish woman, and Ruth was considered fully a convert, so she's definitely considered a Jewish woman. So when it's a Jewish woman who takes on that power and full ownership of her sexuality and making those choices and being assertive, it's viewed as a positive thing. And other women, other peoples, it's not viewed as a positive thing. Just an interesting point of thought. Lynn?
Oh no, I was just thinking nice Jewish girl.
Nice Jewish girl.
Girl.
But being sexually assertive, being assertive in ownership of power. And those are some of the greatest examples that we have of women in the Tanakh is taking on whatever element of power that they could be afforded in those times and in the sort of patriarchal societies in which they were operating. So, but I just thought it would be interesting to bring up negative examples because we see that too. And I'm sure the negative would have been seen during those times just as much as the positive that we do see. Any questions or comments? It's kind of just about the end, really. I just want to point out what next week's topic is, if we, unless anyone has anything else to add. All right, so next week's topic, we only have one more class left, and it's the topic of prophetesses, right? So when I was sick, we skipped that week, so we're coming back to it. We're adding on. Luckily, the month of December has 5 Thursdays, so we still get one extra Thursday. So I'll be remote, but I will still be teaching the class that night. So the topic of prophetesses, and I'm sure we'll have much to discuss. So I look forward to seeing you hopefully at that class. That'll be our last one. I've really enjoyed teaching this so far. I hope you're getting something out of this class. And as always, if you have to miss, want to catch it later, we're going to put it up on our YouTube page. Thank you for